Welcome to Uptime Spotlight, shining light on wind energy's brightest innovators. This is the progress powering tomorrow.
Mads and Anders, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan, for having us. And it's a show we listen to a lot, so a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, we have a really interesting subject here, and I want to pick both your brains about some of the complexities of floating wind in Norway. And we know that the floating offshore wind industry is still relatively new, and it's actually at a critical juncture. And even though we have proven that technology works at scale, we don't have large developments yet. And that is where Norway is stepping in and changing that equation quite radically. Let's just back up a minute. The project's called Utsira Nord, and if you haven't been paying attention, you've been missing a lot because floating wind is going to be the wave of the future. But ultimately, what is the fundamental problem that Utsira Nord is trying to solve?
So, of course, Utsira Nord has been kind of on the verge, I would say, since at least since 2020, but also even before that with Equinor launching their high wind demo turbine, right? The world's first floating wind turbine. And Norway really kind of saw itself as a front runner in floating wind. Fast forward to 2020, the then government opened these areas for offshore wind in Norway with Utsira Nord as one of the bigger floating one, right? 1.5 gigawatt of floating wind. And what Norway kind of wants to do is to take a position within this market. And more kind of this industrial perspective rather than for the energy production, right? Because Norway has, we are self-sufficient for now, at least, but with the electrification going on, we will soon run out of that as well. But for now, and the predictions going on to 2030, we are okay. Looking a bit further, it should be, well, the surplus is going to diminish or at least be far less than we have. So, yeah, that's I guess the problem we are trying to solve is more the transition from being an oil and gas community to also secure the industry for the next phase of energy production, right? And not only oil and gas, but also electricity. And with Norway then being this maritime nation and seeing ourselves as one of the leaders in offshore installations, we see that we can take a position as a leading developer of floating wind as well.
I think it's very interesting, right, that we come along this train, right? Because, like you said, Norway you're rife with renewable energies. You guys have a lot of hydro. You're good there, and the PPA prices for that reason are fairly low comparatively. So, but you have this marine industrial complex that a lot of places don't have. Alan and I have talked about on the podcast many times. In the U.S., we have a lot of coastline, but the really only marine industrial complex we have is in the Gulf of Mexico, to be honest with you, right? Otherwise, it's just kind of port cities and stuff like that. So you guys have, and we talked about this a little bit off air, you know, my past in the oil and gas offshore world, it was like, we need to solve something, bring in the Norwegians, because we know they're going to get it done. We know they're going to do it right. So there's a lot of technology companies that already exist for subsea things up there. You have one of the biggest ones. If you're offshore anywhere, you know about Kongsberg. They're there, right? So that they create all kinds of amazing instrumentation and tools for the marine environment. So you guys have that pedigree, that know-how. So I think it's really cool that the idea is to take that industrial complex and turn it into something that can really turn the economy on for the future, right? As you guys start to, like you said, you start to pivot away from oil and gas, you have this skill sets. You have all of these amazing workers and technicians and professionals there that can do things that other places may not have. So it puts you guys in the kind of the driver's seat for something like offshore floating wind. I think it's really interesting.
Obviously, I'm sitting in Copenhagen. I'm not in Norway with Mass, but I was fortunate enough to work on some of the offshore bids during my time with Equinor, for example. And it's pronounced, it's very clear, those strengths that you speak about in Norway, those opportunities they have, that deep-rooted O&G know-how, very unique, to some extent, potentially an easy transition, something they can capitalize on in the wind sector as well. Curiously, we've seen recently NVE in Norway trying to push the government in the direction of fixed bottom offshore wind, but clearly the government sees that their opportunity there deviates from the, should we say, tried and proven technology. And can they leverage their know-how in that O&G sector, whether it's through platforms, whatever else it is, it's all there. I suppose the key question mark, Alan and Joel, and Mass and I reflect on this a lot, is Norway going to be a nation of exporters of that knowledge? Will it be developed elsewhere? Or do they have the appetite to develop that in their backyard as well? And that's the sort of juncture that we sit at now.
Yeah, because it really comes down to if Utsira Nord isn't completed and if there's not enough participation in the system that's been set up, and we'll talk about that in a moment, the industry on the floating side is really going to be in trouble. We need that leadership and the technology and the knowledge, as Joel has pointed out, of all the Norwegian offshore expertise to go ahead and do a floating project that it was relatively complicated. These floating projects are not easy, particularly way up north. This is a big problem, right? If Norway can pull this off, then pretty much the rest of the world will just follow suit, right?
Yes, but I mean, there's also a competition here, right? We see we see France, we see UK, we see everyone's trying to take this position as the leading country for being the first making a large-scale commercial floating wind farm. So it's just as much an industrial endeavor for Norway and for the rest of the countries. But we also already see Norwegian competencies, right? We see Norwegian ships, and anchor handlers and everything all over the world, also in offshore wind projects. So this is, well, depending on what kind of industry you're looking at, of course, but except for the yards and so on, the industry is already moving in that direction. And what this Utsira Nord can do is just kind of strengthening that effort we see, I would say.
I think that there's a curious thing there, isn't there, Mass? Because there's two elements to this. The first is, as Alan had touched upon a moment ago, is it about Norway leveraging this in their own backyard? Is it something that we just develop elsewhere? The juncture that we're at now, what we're seeing is with the UK floating projects, with what's going on in France, with what's going on in Japan, does Norway now just start sending that knowledge elsewhere, or is it something that they can actually develop locally and keep that local know-how? And I think Alan alluded to it a moment ago. This is a key juncture. When we come back from our Nordic summer holidays, we should hopefully start to see some bidders in the mix. But it's really crunch time, and the Norwegian government, I think they recognize that. So let's see where we land.
Let's put it in sports context, right? We'll try to do this. We can go and be coaches on a soccer team or a soccer team anywhere and help out. However, we have an awesome practice pitch right out our back door. Why don't we practice there as well and refine these things and then take it around the world? Because at the end of the day, 70%-ish of the continental shelf of Norway is too deep for fixed bottom floating. And it's difficult too, right? It's very rocky. There's a lot of the complexities and O&M complexities around that Norwegian coast. And that's kind of, I think, where Alan was going before, is if you can get it there, you have the practice field there to get it right. And this project, this Utsira Nord, it's a shining light right now. The people are focused on it, right? As we've seen tenders moving around the world, there's a lot of people focused on this one in the wind world. And if they can get this one moving, get it nailed, I think that the export of floating wind technology, because your entire value chain is bought into it, can go a big way from Norway going forward to the world.
And I think we ought to talk about what this tender framework looks like, because it's different than things that I have seen, particularly in the United States for offshore. Norway is taking a really different approach to it. Anders, maybe you can walk us through what this process looks like. It's a two-stage process.
Happy to do so, Alan. And I think in part, what's intriguing about this is the three 500 megawatt sites, but ultimately with only one winner of the overall subsidy. And that's a real game changer. So I think what Mass and I have typically seen through, should we call it the boom years, for lack of a better term, in the offshore sector, was companies trying to execute what we called optionality. So we'd have our boardrooms behind us saying, okay, let's have a look at these sites, particularly in an auction that resembles something like a two-step auction we're familiar with from the UK and elsewhere. Give us some optionality in that. Where this deviates substantially, I think, is the new, should we call it, macro outlook in the global economy. Those companies are reticent, I think, to make those kind of bets. And I think with the one subsidy winner in this model, the stakes are very high. So the question is, do we see people go in with a slightly more aggressive attitude as they have in the past, or are people playing the safe game? And some of the announcements that we've seen in the industry of late perhaps lean a little bit to the latter. What I would say, added to the mix, is, of course, Norway did have a fixed bottom auction not long ago. That did have bidders, which perhaps was to the boon of the Norwegian government. But I think this is an intriguing thing, and you had mentioned what's at stake in terms of subsidy. I mean, one might still argue, does it really go far enough? Look at some of the megawatt hour prices that went forward in the UK. It's still a nascent technology, as you'd alluded to before. The LCOE needs to be driven down substantially. There's a long maturation journey, and I think a lot of the sector players know that. So Mass has got his finger on the pulse locally. He's talking to these people in hallways. Let's see who's ready to act.
I think something really important that I like to see in this the tender framework is the scoring. A lot of the scoring is focused on like cost realism, the ability to execute, and it's more pragmatic. It's like, okay, let's put something real down here. Do you have the port facilities? Are you going to be able to do this? Rather than aspirational visions. I like to see things that are down to brass tacks. Okay, how are you going to do this? Do you have the vessels? Do you have the manpower? Do you have the AHT knowledge to be able to moor these things off? How are we going to do this? And I think that's also, again, a very Norwegian point of view. And I like that.
I would also say, so we have an industry term, which is speculative bids. They're trying to kill off those speculative bids. Those have undermined the sector as a whole substantially. With that said and done, all the things you just mentioned are fantastic aspirations to have, but the reality of the situation, I'll revert to my term earlier, this is a nascent technology. There is not a plug and play WTG out there that they can just drop and get to work. So it's the right way to go about things, pragmatism, as you said, and the move away from very highly qualitative criteria, which was in place in the last failed round or the stopped round, is now taken off the table. So I think that's positive, and I'd agree with you there, Joel. Clamp down on the speculative bids. My main concern is the macro situation and the nascency of the sector. So those are things that the Norwegian government has to recognize and tackle as well.
What you kind of alluded to here is, or you mentioned briefly, is that there was a failed round, right? So Utsira Nord was actually announced first in 2023. And then we saw delay, and then the government said, well, we'll get back to you, right? And when they came back now, they had just tightened all the screws and kind of made this framework even tighter than it was, because when we were looking at it, when we were in RWE, this wasn't the easiest way forward, but at least it was easier than it is now, because now you have these qualification requirements, right? With you have to have at least 20% of every stage of your development of a wind farm, so development, construction, and operation, and that wind farm needs to have been more than 200 megawatts and has been and become online no earlier than 2015. So, I mean, that also kind of shrinks down the participants that could actually bid here.
I totally agree, Mass. If you look at the basic criteria, cost level and realism, which you alluded to there, Joel, innovation and technological development, but less speculative than it used to be. And the key, I think, here is the execution capability, which Mass had alluded to. So that sort of takes the speculative bidders out of the game. Proven projects in operation, that really slims the field. So I think I hear where you're going with your next question, Joel and Alan. I'll throw that back over to you guys and let Mass field that one.
Well, how many potential bidders are there if they have to have 200 megawatts of offshore wind already deployed? What does that list look like?
Well, it's become shorter, right? And it kind of just after the announcement, it kind of grew shorter by the hour.
We watched it dwindle through the press, right?
So now I think, well, at least what the media and everyone's saying is that we are potentially looking at 3 players that is expected to bid. None has confirmed, but of course, 3 might. But also this kind of strict requirements has also made somewhat of a turmoil or so, because the smaller operators of course doesn't like this, right? Or the one that has this business model of developing and building but not operating.
Yep, flipping, yeah.
Yeah. So that is, I mean, do they have less of an experience compared to an investor who has been in all the phases? I would say no. But I mean, so you get these questions about who really qualifies. Is it the right qualifications?
Is there space for a consortium in there? Like if there is one of these smaller players that's kind of like aggressive and they want to really get something done, but they don't necessarily have the track record, they go and grab an RWE or someone of that sort to say like, hey, we really want to do this, but we brought Big Brother in to be our facilitator.
But that's as much as bringing down the risk profile on these projects, right? So I think what we're going to see, I would like to think one of the maturation journeys we see through this sort of challenge that the sector's facing at the moment is proliferation of consortia that can carry these sort of projects. And I think it's necessary in terms of capital, it's necessary to drive down risk, it's necessary to leverage each other's know-how. I think we're going to see that more and more. But going back to something Joel and Alan mentioned a moment ago, I think Mass and I, from our experience on the Norwegian markets, has shown that you might not hear too many murmurings from individual players, but what you do see in Norway is highly active industry organizations. And I would expect if there's an element of pushback, whether it's related to the subsidy, whether it's related to the criteria, it will usually be channeled through those groups, because none of the critical, particularly Norwegian players, want to be seen giving direct pushback. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more announcements coming from those angles.
At the same time, Anders, we saw the same thing with SN2, right? We saw more and more players saying, well, no thanks, not this time, right? And ended up with a very few number of bidders.
I've had much the same experience in Norway, I felt, through our regulatory teams as we had in Denmark. So the public side of the equation does tend to be relatively open to dialogue. It doesn't necessarily move the needle sufficiently, but we are involved in markets where that dialogue is relatively open. We're getting to a late stage in Norway, but there is somebody on the other side of the table willing to discuss, and let's see where that takes us.
So there is an inherent risk here, right? We've talked with some other people that are developing some offshore floating platform, and there's a risk, but there is an appetite in certain ways, right? Like I said, one of the leading insurance companies and the insurers are the ones who are going to underwrite the whole thing. That's a Norwegian-based company. They want to be the head of, or that lead boat, pun intended, I guess, for offshore floating wind insurance. So you have that appetite there. Okay, we have the subsidy that's going to be in place. What other mechanisms are they putting in place to possibly reduce the risk so that Norway can jump ahead of the line and prove their might in this sector?
it's the subsidy that's kind of it's the tool that the government uses to drive this, and of course favorable politics and so on, right? But apart from that, we really don't see. This is so the floating wind endeavor for Norway is going to be developed as close to a market condition as possible, realizing that for a few years now, or for the first projects, there will be a need for state support in some way or the other. But the government will not step in and kind of do a direct market intervention. That's not what they want to do. That's also a problem when it comes kind of, because now it's a Labour government. They are very positive to floating wind, offshore wind, kind of driving this. The Conservative opposition is somewhat more reluctant to take that position. They are pointing to market conditions and saying, well, if it can't pay for itself, why should we pay for it, right?
All sounds very familiar in the Norwegian context.
Yeah. So it's kind of, that doesn't mean that when or if they come to power, they will not give the state support, because, I think they will, because I see this industrial effort that we need to take sooner or later.
So I think Mass has alluded to a few of the challenges there, actually. So again, I'll go back to that point, appetite. Where does the Norwegian government's appetite, how far can that take us? Because they need to play a very prominent role if this is to succeed. Energy prices in Norway are extremely low. So the potential for PPA market, question marks. You asked about risk mitigation. I think great if the insurance companies are on this, but project finance now, we're in a whole different ballgame than we were 3 years ago. So can any companies come on this on an equity basis? The project finances. So it's a challenging market. And again, I would say the Norwegian government, they're in the hot seat. Can they deliver? Can they carry this over the line? That's very much about if they want it in their own backyard or if they export that knowledge. And it's an exciting time.
What does the winner of this process do differently than the companies that don't win this process? What does that look like? What are they probably going to do that makes them the winning bid?
So if I'd been looking at this again in the rearview mirror some time ago, I would be looking at companies that have a specific strategic interest there. So are they looking to future market opportunities in the near area? Are they looking to tie up certain supply chain and knowledge upsides by being a first mover? Again, the sort of moves in the market, the macroeconomic situation probably pushes back against that a little bit. I think Mass and I probably, going back some months, would have said, you'd very much be looking at the Norwegian players here. This should be in their interest to push forward on this. But they've been some of the most vocal about coming out and casting a bit of doubt on it. So again, I think the macroeconomic situation is slowly improving. That's going to be a big player. Does it come too soon? But again, we have seen in recent auctions, there's still an appetite for some strategic interest. Which players might come forward there and surprise us? Or are they just going to look at leveraging progress from the UK, from France and other markets?
And that kind of strategic view, right? That's also very interesting to look at, because you see, so who are the expected bidders here, right? So it's Equinor and Vårgrønn, and it's EDF, Deep Wind Offshore, at least, right? So Equinor, having led the floating wind market now for almost 2 decades, Vårgrønn stepping in on Greenvolt. You got EDF, right, with the projects in France. So it seems like these big players taking the strategic position, or wanting to keep their strategic position. I would expect them to be there. But we also see the likes of Japanese companies, right? With Kansai, we see TEPCO, we see kind of everyone kind of looking what to learn from the Norwegian process here. Because we talked about so Utsira Nord is kind of, well, unfortunately, it's not going to be the first anymore without, like we here in Norway hope for. We see the French projects, so we see the French projects, we see UK projects and so on. But Utsira Nord is maybe the stepping stone project you need for ultra deep waters, right? At around 200 meters depth, it kind of doubles what we see for the other projects. And then moving to West Coast, the US or Japan, right? It becomes really deep. So I think that is also kind of makes this attractive for a lot of operators or developers, taking that strategic view of it.
I think that's an interesting one as well. That's an interesting one there, Mass. And it could be, I mean, are we going to see, as we've seen in some other markets local to me, where large Japanese investors have come in and invested directly in renewable energy projects? I mean, we're talking big money. Are they going to step in and take a vested interest in this? Are we going to see some of the ONG discussions going on in the background that we might not be anticipating? I think it had either been Joel or Alan or even Phil who'd alluded to it in a past podcast. Is there something going on in the background? It just seems to defy rationale that that's not already happening. So could there be moves going on in the background that help to elevate this? And then the Norwegian government, they're not in any shortage of strategizing. Where do they take it? So there could be a joker in the hand somewhere there.
Exactly. Which of the companies we've talked about, or maybe a company we haven't mentioned yet, has the best access to capital to pull off a project like this and then pull off subsequent projects?
I would say Equinor.
I would say so, and I think it's companies that have been able to leverage their work in ONG. That is kind of paying the renewables business at the moment. So how, on the flip side, a lot of those big players we see have divested or showed less appetite for renewables of late due to the boom in the ONG sector. I would say some of the big developers, not necessarily ONG, some of the bigger developers we know, they're looking for more bankable projects. So again, they may be reticent to throw a huge amount of capital into projects along these lines. So I think going back to what Mass said, it might be one of the more expected players. It might be someone leaning on their ONG finance. But again, all of that's highly speculative. And this is one of those auctions I look at as a bid manager, and I'd say, this is a tough one to call.
Why I would say Equinor is you see a lot of the oil and gas majors divesting from offshore wind. BP, Shell, Repsol. You've seen that happen. However, what we just saw, 6 months ago, Alan, Equinor stuck 10% of cash into Ørsted.
We know it well. Here in Copenhagen, we know it well.
They still have that taste in their mouth for and Equinor as a company mirrors the Norwegian transition goals.
But I'd challenge that, Joel, because I would say, I would challenge that and say, great, Equinor's bought into it. And I've had the pleasure of working with Equinor, great company to work together with, great people, fantastic know-how there. Thoroughly enjoyed my time working together with them. I would say that acquisition, what it tells me is that they are more keen to invest in mature or developed opportunities. So if you look at certain auctions coming up and how much operational capacity you need to have, they might be excluded from things that suddenly they're in the game with by virtue of being with Ørsted. On the flip side, there might not be the same appetite for development, because what you do see in a lot of these players is saying, okay, we'll take a sit back and watch attitude. Same might be the case in floating. We'll take a sit back and watch, and then we'll buy in because we're capital heavy at a later stage. So I'm speculating. It was great for Ørsted. It was great for Denmark. It's great for Equinor. But what their motives are, no one really knows.
I can completely see that. Yeah.
They invest in Ørsted, right? Big player in bottom fix. They have the projects in the US and so on and so on. The floating projects, they're really chasing on their own, it seems. And it's more kind of bringing that legacy from the Hywind demo and Hywind Scotland, Hywind Tampen, right? Just bringing that forward, building on that know-how, that legacy. But also, people are telling me they are not they don't need to use the high wind concept. They are looking at different types of floater as well, right? So just using that knowledge, leveraging that, and moving from, as I said, high wind Scotland to high wind Tampen, the cost reduction there was it 36% or something like that? So I mean, yeah, seeing that progress, it's really good.
We can sit and have conjecture until we're blue in the face here. What we need to do is get this thing going, and then once someone wins this thing, the 3 or 4 of the 4 of us get back on and talk about it. Then I think that's the good plan.
No, absolutely, Joe. And I think, if we want to look at the upsides here, I mean, you're talking about a technology with capacity factors that are unheard of. I mean, even offshore wind, people are out there talking about, we're talking 40% plus, exceptional sites. And now we're talking about something that's over 60. Okay, the cost curve has to come down substantially. We're talking, for our good friends in the NIMBY world, not in my backyard. Well, this is a long way off your backyard, and I doubt anyone's out at 800 meters of depth, right?
Except for the people living on Utsira.
But from what people say, they're some of the more open people to having something in their backyard in any case. But then there's there's the longer term strategic opportunities that some of those deep water markets, and as you said, the opportunity there is massive. I mean, fixed is well established, but the good sites in a lot of countries, actually, they're starting to dry up a little bit. And you're looking at substantial markets. You're looking at markets in the Far East that have deep water very close to China, but are a little bit dubious about whether they want to dip into that market. So great opportunities there. So floating, it is the future. It will come. It's about driving the cost down. It's about making it competitive. The macroeconomic climate is against it right now, but I think we're in little doubt about where that's going longer term.
So the next big stage for Utsira Nord is in September, when all the bids will be reviewed, and the process really starts then, which is going to be an exciting time. In order to follow this process, one of the things everybody should do is listening to the podcast is go download the document that Mads and Anders put together. Mads, how do you go find that document that talks about Utsira Nord and the process that Norway has set up?
Well, it's quite easy, I would say. So you go to this website of my advisory called Vedøy, so Mavedoy.no, and there's a link to the report. It says Utsira Nord 2025, so should be quite easy to find.
It's a great report.
Yeah, and of course we, as we have posted on LinkedIn as well, we are not tied to anyone, so. But we really like this project, and was thinking to ourselves, or I was thinking to myself, I know something about this that I want to share, and then I reached out to Anna's and another colleague of ours, Nikolai Kutsnikov, to say, well, could we make something together to share what we know, what we have learned, how we see this. And hopefully it's for someone can use it, right? If it's a developer, if it's a supplier, anyone, and we just at least when we made that was kind of, let's share what we know. Let's make this project as good as we can do. Let's contribute in our way, because it's not always about making money. It's also about doing things you love. So yeah.
As Mads had said, the element of impartiality is key in this. So for the first time, we saw an opportunity that we could go into a market that we were passionate about, a technology that we were passionate about, something that is coming not too far down the line in the future. And how could we chip into that from our own perspectives and from experience? Again, together with our colleague Nikolai, who also brings a vast amount of substation and cabling experience. I think we had a pretty thorough package. And if I go back to having sat all of us within large developers, we covered things from a number of angles. So we're fortunate enough to have discussions with some of the big developers still in hallways, hear where they're going. They hold their cards close to their chest. But I think probably this report would reflect a lot of their take on things as well.
This has been a great discussion, and I need everybody who's listening to the podcast to go download this report about Utsira Nord. It's going to be one of the big projects to watch going forward. And you can do that by going to the website, and I'm going to spell it out. It's mavedoy.no, Norway. And download it there. It's free. And the framework is great. The discussion is great in the document. It's very simple to understand, even for an electrical engineer like me. But it also lays out the sort of the pathway that this process will take and gives you an idea of like who's going to participate, which is fascinating. So Anders and Mads, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We're going to have you back in September, October, when everything settles out to see who's participating. It'll be really interesting to see.
That's a deal. That's a deal. And perhaps from my side, Mass, before we sign off, I could just throw in a little sign off from my side. So to sort of break the tension a little bit, because we got some exciting times coming up and people sweating behind the scenes developing bids. But question for you. Why did the floating wind turbine bring a suitcase to the conference? Because it knew it wasn't going anywhere fast, but when it does, it's taking the whole energy transition with it.
All right. Well, Mads and Anders, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Love having you on. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, gentlemen, and look forward to hearing more podcasts over the summer period. Thanks a lot.